Hi, I'm Quinn Thacker. This is the story, The Gift, or Ramses the Dam's Christmas Surprise, by me, Quinn Thacker, but primarily by my good friend and excellent writer, MJ Roos. And we dedicate this to Anne Rice and her son. And we know Anne Rice would have hated that we did this. And we think that's appropriate. Julie stared into great blue eyes that watched her without blinking. This was a battle of wills, and Julie, so used to winning her battles, felt a small stirring of unease. She could not blink first. She would not. The cat had to understand who was queen in her domain. I will not blink, she told herself fiercely. I will be damned if I blink first. The thought almost made her laugh. She was damned already, as much as her fiancé, Reginald Ramsay, an ancient pharaoh who is also called Ramses the Damned, to his close friends. She shook her head a little, realizing that her thoughts had become distracted, and that the cat had noticed, and stalked a little forward, pert, dainty white paw extended forward as though she was considering using Julie's distraction as an opportune moment to begin her attack. Suddenly, the cat's blue eyes reminded Julie of eyes she had seen last in Cairo, before they had returned home to London. Those eyes had looked into her own as deeply as the cat's did now. Great ferocious eyes that had stared into hers intently, full of life and a domineering will. Eyes that Julie was certain had been closed forever by a fiery automobile explosion, accidentally caused by her Ramses. A painful chapter in his millennia-long life had closed in that moment, and he had not spoken the name of Cleopatra since. Julie blinked and looked away, as below, on the first landing, she heard the lock turn and the door swing open. A whoosh of cold air and snow flurries blew into the foyer, as Ramses the Great, ancient pharaoh who had ruled over Egypt, a mortal being who had advised countless kings and queens of the old world, who had slept undreaming for thousands of years, stepped into the house and delicately, finger by finger, began to take off his gloves. "Darling, close the door," Julie called with some irritation to the ancient, undying being who had chosen her to be his bride and queen. She had not expected him home this early. Ramses had never before seen snow, let alone this quantity of it, and she had expected him to stay outdoors for many hours, as was his habit when he encountered anything new to him. They had been waylaid by carolers this morning as they walked home from tea with their dear friend Elliot, and as the last strains of "Fa la 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 la" had died away, the first flakes of snow began to drift gently downward, settling on Julie's lashes, reddening her cheeks and the tip of her nose. She had glanced up to see Ramses staring down at her wonderingly. Her breath caught, but he only swept her up in his arms, laughing joyously. "Snow! This is snow! I did not think there were any natural wonders left for me to experience. My whole life will be filled with surprises like this, with you, Julie, my immortal queen, by my side." Looking down at him as he swung her around, she cared nothing for the polite onlookers who averted their gaze. Hello, cats. Okay, alright, I have to find where I was. Looking down at him as he swung her around, she cared nothing for the polite onlookers who averted their gazes from her and Ramses' display of love. The meaningless opinions of others would never matter to her ever again. Instead, the whole purpose of her deathless existence would bend toward giving Ramses moments like this, day after day, year after year, into eternity. She would hear him laugh with amazement forever. But to do that, she had to keep him distracted while she picked up his Christmas present. And so she had suggested he wander the streets, taking in his first snowfall, and she would meet him at home. She had expected him to arrive disheveled, with snow turned to water from the intense heat of his body dripping from his hair, just before dinner, or even long after. But as he gazed up at her to where she stood on the landing above him, She could see that, as he always did, he was about to disrupt her well-laid plans. And he was about to ascend the stairs and discover the cat, his first ever Christmas present, long before she'd had the chance to secret the kitten away in a remote part of her large and stately London abode. Her thoughts raced. This was a disaster. How could she prevent what was about to happen? "Darling, I was just about to step out," she said, her thoughts barely staying ahead of her tongue. She grabbed her coat from where she had draped it over the banister to let it drip onto the expensive Persian rug. Who could help her? Elliot? No. She cast the thought aside as soon as it occurred to her. One of her dearest friends, an older gentleman who had recently become immortal himself, he would be a poor choice to take care of the kitten in the few days remaining before Christmas. He was exploring his new lease on undying life, as only an insatiable being could. She and Ramses had been lucky to tear him away from his constant supply of lovers, male and female alike. It had disturbed her greatly to come to his apartment in what was once a fashionable neighborhood of London and have the door opened by a young man who could have been the twin of her father in his youth. Elliot, in his younger days, had been a companion of her father's, and she strongly suspected they had been in love. Elliot was also the father of Julie's former fiancé, Alex. Despite these close connections, Julie felt keenly that she could not expose the kitten to Elliot's orgies and excesses. It just wasn't right. But Julie's mind returned to Alex. Dependable Alex. Good Alex. He had always been there for her, even after she began to love another. And just like that, she had a plan. "You're home so early. I wasn't expecting you home until later," she said, draping her coat over her shoulders. She listened as she ducked back into the bedroom, looking for the kitten. Where has the damned cat gone? She settled a wide-brimmed hat over her hair as her eyes frantically roamed the lavishly decorated room. Why had she insisted on the frills and curtains? All that frivolousness could easily hide a small white kitten and foil her plan before she'd even had time to step out the door. And behind her, she heard Ramses begin to ascend the stairs. "As it turns out," he said in his immaculately polished voice, "I hate the cold." "You?" she laughed, still scanning the room desperately. "I would have thought the heat of your body—" Her cheeks flushed as she thought of the furnace that seemed to burn in his chest and between his legs. "Would keep you warm even in Arctic conditions. As it turns out, my love, I could think only of you and the warmth of your body," he said from the top of the stairs. Even in her desperate distraction, the huskiness of his voice made her nipples peak and her sex tingle. Her silk underwear began to dampen. She longed to feel his hardness slipping between her legs, driving deep into her. Thanks, MJ. Damn it all, where is that cat? All of a sudden, she saw 3 small whiskers trembling behind the emerald velvet curtains along the far wall. And as the door behind her opened, she pounced on the feline and shoved it deep into her heavy winter coat, smothering its squawking meow with her voice as she exclaimed, "Oh, my love, I feel the same way." And then he was behind her, turning her around, trying to touch the low, sensitive parts of her that were already throbbing for him through her coat. The immortal hunger that she had felt ever since she drank the potion, that conveyed power over death, surged within her. It was never satisfied, no matter how many times he plunged his hand into her aching, throbbing center, as he was attempting to do now. Oh, she was hungry for him, and as he turned her toward him, she was unable to think, to breathe, and she made small animal sounds as she tangled her free hand in his hair. The other hand held a cat, and remembering that made her stop suddenly and move toward the door despite his protestations. "You have to wait, my love," she said. "I have I told you, I have a hair appointment." A hair appointment? She thought stupidly, her mind imagining all the things he would do in her absence, him splayed out on their bed, gripping himself, pumping quick and hard. She had to get out of the house, and like a fugitive on the run, she plunged into the Arctic wintry landscape, and her immortal king stayed behind, doing exactly what she had imagined he would. Alex had been home from Cairo a full 2 weeks before he admitted to himself that he was depressed. At first, he'd told himself that he was simply resting. Journeys were arduous, and he'd had a taxing one mentally, emotionally, and physically. But even after 2 days of rest, his energy hadn't returned. His curtains stayed shut against the cold and the gray winter light. His apartment stayed unlit and frigid. His luggage stayed packed, a task normally performed by servants that he could no longer afford. And he stayed in bed, except to make himself pots of tea and gaze into the single fire he had made for himself. Until the doorman knocked on his door to tell him he had a visitor. He knew it was his father, Elliot, who had come back to England long before Alex, alongside Ramsay and Julie, his former fiancée. He no longer had feelings for her aside from a distant, nostalgic pain. His thoughts were consumed with blue eyes, ferocious eyes, that gazed up at him as the train barreled toward them. Even as fire consumed the automobile they had been in. Her screams. God, her screams. He shut his eyes, leaned his head against the wall beside the open door, and said, "Let my father in." "Ah, it's not Elliot," said a bright, feminine voice. And indeed, it was Julie who stood before him now. And her eyes, which had been brown before, were a bright, piercing blue, underneath her wide-brimmed hat, which was speckled with fluffy snowflakes. "Oh, is it snowing?" he said stupidly, and then he saw the cat peeking out from inside the breast of Julie's gigantic coat. His hands immediately went into a beseeching position that universally meant, "Give me the baby." "Did you get back last night?" she asked, as she settled the kitten into his hands. "Yes, last night, absolutely," he replied absently. "Who is this? Why? How?" he said as she settled the kitten into his hands. His hands dwarfed the kitten's small body, and he brought her to his chest. The next thing he knew, she climbed up his chest, and a cold, wet nose nuzzled his ear. He laughed. He laughed! "Is she for me?" he asked, loving her already. Julie's face fell. Not exactly," she said, her voice conflicted and awkward. "I was hoping that you could help me." She trailed off. Right, of course, he thought, bitterness tinging his thoughts. "She's a present for Ramsay," he said flatly. Her downcast eyes told him everything he needed to know. He grimaced and turned away for just a moment, but then turned back. As always, he was too well-bred and too agreeable a person to reveal what he was truly feeling. He would never willingly cause someone discomfort, even if that person had spurned his offer of marriage and was now standing on his doorstep, begging for his help. "How can I help?" he asked gently. Alex stared into great blue eyes that stared back into his without blinking. And, like Julie, it was not lost on him how similar they were to the loving, mad eyes of the woman who had died next to him in Cairo. Alex turned back to his work. He had been journaling, trying to make sense of his feelings, trying to empty them onto paper, thus freeing his mind to focus on more practical things. Or so he hoped. He had never been a particularly good or prolific writer. Because these writings were private, he reasoned, neither their quality nor their quantity mattered. He would burn them immediately, and none would be the wiser. Burn, he thought. Burn. Fire. Crash. He jolted himself back to reality, hastily redressing himself in his own good humor. It used to be his uniform. Now, he felt, it was a costume. "Ha! Another woman for me to care for, only to lose her," he quipped casually, accusingly, to the kitten. "I won't fall for it this time. Thankfully, by God, my dalliance with you has an expiration date. You have your run of my rooms, little beast. Go." Alex turned again to the little white fluff ball climbing about on his favorite reading chair, expecting her to prance out of the study at his command. The kitten stretched her front legs, elongating her tiny back, before trotting about in a circle and curling up contentedly on the footstool nearest Alex. "A few days," he thought. "It's just a few days. I want to help Julie. I will show her that I care for her as a friend and support her happiness, even if that means supporting her outlandish schemes. What would an immortal king want with a kitten? And the housekeepers can surely remove This damned white hair from everything, right? Drifting into his own thoughts, he prompted himself to begin writing again. His non-sequitur stream of consciousness populated the page until he could fit no more. Pausing to begin a new sheet, Alex noticed a soft, steady purr coming from the kitten. "Your tactics won't work, little beast," he mused quietly, not stopping his pen, not lifting his eyes, "though I admit you are a formidable opponent." Instead of beginning anew, Alex reviewed his writings, feeling perhaps he had spilled more than enough of his emotions onto the page today. After all, he was a gentleman. He needed to rein himself in and go out into the world with a jolly disposition. It was the season for such things. He could pretend to be unaffected and, in doing so, become unaffected, surely. As he read, he felt lighter, as if the slightest weight was being lifted for him through the process of delineating his thoughts and releasing them from the vice grips of his daily consciousness. Once the words were on the page, he was their master, their king. He could look down upon them and observe them for what they were, mere feelings, temporary nonsense. Alternatively, sometimes he thought he might as well be reading the diary of a madman. Fitting, he thought. Given the relative sanity of the women I have loved, it would be suspicious if I were not a little mad myself. "I have become one strange, sad sap, haven't I?" he asked to no one in particular, with a melancholy chuckle, laying the sheet of paper onto his desk with his left hand as he gazed out the snowy window. He had the sudden realization that he was gently stroking the purring kitten with his other hand. Unsure how long he had been doing this, he snatched his hand away. "Bother. Have some self-control, man." All of Alex's self-control, indeed, his entire sense of self, flew away as he pushed the dress up to her hip. He claimed her mouth and then relinquished it, kissing her collarbone, her shoulder, crumpling her silk dress in his hands. He meant to be soft and slow and considerate, but she was moaning in his ear as his hands roamed from her ass to her breasts, and he became wild and ferocious. His hands weren't enough. He had to use his mouth. He dipped his head and sucked on one of her nipples into his mouth, and her cry of pleasure nearly undid him. Her hips moved against him. He ground against her, and she met him with every thrust. Every thought abandoned him. He gave himself fully to distraction, embraced it with welcoming arms, let the feel of his body on hers burn through all of it. There was only her hair, her skin, her mouth, and he was licking and tasting and biting all of it. There was only the press of her body against his. Close, but she could be closer, and he wanted her more than anything, wanted this lack of remembering more than anything. He slid his hands under her, grasping her, and lifted her on top of him. She wrapped her legs around him and moaned again as she pressed herself against the hardness between his thighs. He needed this temporary escape from his mind, whatever was burning down deep inside him, the memories that hounded him relentlessly. He needed this, needed her. She ground her hips against his, a slow, competent push of her wet heat against the hardness of him, and moaned again. The scent of smoke came to him, as smoke always does. He smelled it. There could be no mistaking it, and realized he'd been smelling it for quite some time. The shock and panic flooded him. Her moans turned to screams, first of ecstasy and then quickly to terror, fear, and pain. Just moments before he had been caught in the ecstasy of not remembering, and he wasn't remembering. He was experiencing the horror and torment of that moment, not as a memory, but as an ordeal that he was reliving. A train barreled toward them, and Alex leapt out of the car. A piercing whistle pierced his ears and made him duck frantically as, faster than he could believe possible, the train screamed past him. Metal screeched all around him. He screamed something he wouldn't remember later, tried to erase the knowledge of what came next. Her body flung into the air, her hands reaching for him, even as fire bloomed all around her. But he never saw it. Instead, he experienced profound reprieve. The knowledge that he was dreaming came to him suddenly, with great clarity. He was no longer under the sway of his slumbering, traumatized thoughts. He swam eagerly toward wakefulness, desperate to escape. The terrible memory that had so deeply affected his mind as nothing else in his relatively short life had before. His first great loss. a catastrophe that had almost claimed his life as well. But it hadn't. He lived. He remained. He opened his eyes and stared woodenly at the ceiling for a long moment. Terrible guilt and shame gnawed at him, and he had no inner defenses for those feelings. He was unused to feeling them. Never before in his life had he suffered from them so deeply. But at least he wasn't dreaming anymore. Gradually he began to wonder what had woken him, what had broken through his dream which had seemed so real, so vivid, so heartbreaking. That sense that he had been reliving rather than remembering that moment came to him again, but he tempered it with deep, calming breaths. He was still staring fixedly at the ceiling when something in his bed moved. Alex reacted with the speed and agility of a salmon leaping upstream against a waterfall. He flopped insensibly around the room until his urgent panic subsided. He gaped at the bed. The disarrayed covers twitched. By the time he lit the candle beside his bed with trembling fingers, he knew it was the kitten. Still, it was one too many scares for the night, and Alex's nerves were frazzled. He didn't know how he should react to the perplexing problem of a tiny kitten in his bed, never having had a familiar relationship with the feline species. Should he scold the kitten? Try to teach her not to think of his bed as someplace she was welcome? Was she hungry? He wasn't sure how often kittens needed to be fed. How many days until Christmas? He realized with shame that he couldn't remember what day of the week it was. Why was he responsible for another creature when he could barely take care of himself right now? His concern became tinged with resentment. Why was it always taking care of others? Why was his lot in life to learn over and over again that he was always extending a helping hand and never received one in return? He finally registered that his hand stung, and he looked down. He saw a small red line on his palm. His thumb hurt too, and he looked at 2 sets of small indents, roughly the size and shape of a kitten, as if a kitten had painfully bitten him, not just once, but twice. Why had the creature crawled into his bed? To attack him? Then he realized that he had been pulled suddenly out of his dream and into reality, so quickly that even his subconscious had been curious about what had caused it. The covers twitched again, and a soft mew escaped from its warm depths. Another possibility slowly occurred to Alex. Could the kitten possibly have intentionally woken him from his nightmare? He looked down at his hand again, and then back at the lump on his bed. He twitched the covers back. Wide blue eyes stared back at him. He sat on the edge of the bed, and she crawled up to him, climbing into his lap and nestling there. Had this creature taken care of him? A rush of affection suffused him. He scratched the cat's ears, and she mewed again. "Do you have a name? What should I call you?" he mused. It wasn't hard to think of the right one, once he put his mind to it. "How do you feel about Bastet, little one?" The kitten purred. Their days proceeded thus. When Alex read the newspaper for the first time since he'd been home, Bastet purred warmly to remind him of where his attention should be. When that didn't work, she patted his hand with one paw. He smiled and scratched her ears. On the second day of their cohabitation, Alex realized she had claimed one of the chairs in his apartment. It was a chair with an excellent vantage point of the front door, the bedroom, and the small kitchen that Alex rarely used, but it was where he fed her. He nodded approvingly at her choice and winced only slightly when he heard her claws digging into the fabric as she climbed her way up it. She perched regally atop the pillow when she reached her destination. "You are extremely cute," he pointed out. She considered his observation gravely. On the third day, Alex began talking to himself. He wasn't concerned, he told himself out loud. He'd been through so much, and he wasn't talking to himself, not really. Bastet always participated in his conversations, telling him what she thought in long, drawn-out yowls, punctuating them with meows. She always got the last word. On the 5th day, Bastet emptied Alex's sock drawer. He kept a sock out for her after he had put the rest away. She play-fought, of all things, a toilet. Alex made little balls of newspaper and rolled them for her. He learned to keep his shoes where she couldn't get to them, or he would find newspaper balls stuffed into them. He made himself tea, and while he was emptying the kettle, he saw her dipping her paw in the tea. He laughed as she shook out her damp paw, getting tea everywhere. It was always easy for Alex to give his heart away to the lonely, desperate creatures of the world. On the 6th day, Bastet was trying out all the new sounds she had discovered she was capable of making when someone knocked at Alex's door and his spirit sank. Julie held the kitten out to a horrified Ramses. "Why have you brought me this?" Ramses asked flatly. "Is this some kind of modern holiday tradition? Don't tell me. You have all perverted another pagan tradition. I will not sacrifice a cat, darling. It is against my nature. The goddess Bastet shall be revered by me now, even if men of the current day disregard her. She is the goddess of women's secrets, after all, and I do love women and their secrets." "Ha! Nothing so barbaric as that. She's simply a Christmas surprise for you, my love," Julie said. "A pet to keep us company and warm the winter chill. Isn't she positively adorable? Alex took care of her for a few days because you are terribly difficult to keep secrets from." Ramses lifted the kitten and inspected her as if she were a curious puzzle box. He looked at Julie's hopeful face, resigned to his fate. He wished to make his queen, Julie, happy. However, keeping a regal beast like a cat as a mere pet makes a mockery of the gods. Could Julie not have known? She was normally so clever, so adept to his every whim and feeling. A joke. It is but a joke. Ha ha! Clever Julie. She would know that the very idea of keeping, of all creatures, a cat as a pet would be most humorous to him. She, his great love, knew him all too well. "Ha ha! Very well done, darling," Ramses barked. "I am most amused." He gently growled the last words into Julie's ear so she felt the warmth and spice of his breath. He placed the kitten on the adjacent tea table to free his hands and cupped Julie's hips, urging her toward him. "I will thank her, my Julie, my cunning queen. I shall give her something cunning in return." She pressed herself into his broad chest, raising her delicate face to his. Ramses traced the palms of his hands up her body, pausing to appreciate each of his queen's treasures, her jewels. He held her face in his strong, elegant hands. Suddenly ravenous for her warmth, he bent his head down to claim her mouth. Before he could reach her, she reached up and pressed her index finger to his mouth, stopping his approach. "It's not a joke, Ramses. She's supposed to be a gift and a pet for us to share. I thought you would be delighted." "I am delighted, but you know I cannot keep a cat as a pet," Ramses said in an obvious tone, as if it were a foregone conclusion. "I will not demean myself or the creature by keeping it captive, letting it eat until it becomes fat and useless. This is not the way of things." Julie pouted thoughtfully but did not respond. Right now, she would let him have his way with her, but she would get her way too, eventually. She removed her finger, performing her own tactile survey of his chiseled immortal torso. Ramses sprang to attention under her descending touch. He finally, desperately claimed her mouth with his. Julie began to stroke him, teasing him. She tactfully unbuckled his leather belt and removed it entirely with a flourish. As she held the belt out to dispose of it, she felt a tiny force battering the belt. "Meow!" called the kitten, reaching its paw toward Julie, willing for her to play. Julie tore her face away from Ramses to look at the innocent kitten with the big blue eyes. "This will never do, darling," Ramses declared. "This little beast has no concept of decorum nor of timing." In one sudden athletic motion, Ramses gathered a titillated Julie in his arms and awayed with her up to their bedchamber, closing the door behind them. He placed her on the bed, her breast heaving visibly, straining against the bodice of her dress. Ramses' long fingers danced across her body, longing to free her and feel her warmth. Her pale silken skin pressed to his. Together the lovers became a whirlwind of greedy hands and rapacious mouths. Scantily clothed, hair tousled, they were glistening with a sheen of sweat, glowing in the light of the fireplace. "I do not need a pet. I do not need a fire. I need only Julie, Julie, Julie to keep me warm during the winter chill," thought Ramses. Immortal and insatiable, his soul imprisoned in a maelstrom of time and tragedy. She was the answer, his everlasting panacea. Julie moaned and pulled Ramsay's golden hips to her, feeling his unrepenting length into her. Satisfied, watching the cardinal pleasure overtake Julie's pristine face, Ramses continued his rhythmic composition. Julie was the conductor, and he would make whatever music she wished. Their symphony calmed and swelled in perfect synchronicity. They were one melody, and they were rapidly approaching crescendo. Ramses, Julie's revelry stopped abruptly, interrupted by a crash in the hallway. The symphony ceased. Both Julie and Ramses, dazed, looked toward the door, which promptly creaked open. The small white kitten trotted into the room, bounding onto the bed. She began to pounce and play with the strands of Julie's hair that lay splayed in a halo around her head. Julie began to laugh. Ramses was no longer amused. Insufferable beast, Ramses muttered. The little goddess has done this on purpose. It is her intent to prevent our pleasure at every turn. She does not want to be our captive. I swear, darling, she has it out for us. Go then, return to your temple, or the wild, be free. Instead of scampering away, the kitten merely raised her sparkling blue eyes to Ramses. Julie expected her king to relent in this perfect, charming moment. Instead, Ramses sighed, stood from the bed, and began to dress. I'm going to call on Elliot, Ramses said. Perhaps you should schedule another hair appointment. You're going to need it if our new pet continues her wrathful scheme. Ramses, somehow looking more polished than even before their stymied romp, disappeared gracefully down the stairs. You are not spending Christmas alone. Father will be here soon, surely, Alex said to himself, pacing. He absent-mindedly kicked a ball of newspaper on the study floor and watched it roll under an armchair. He sat insolently to sip his tea, but immediately smirked at his own playfulness. Nothing in the newspaper held his interest today. He wanted to be out in the brisk air, to see friends. He felt a small spark of his old self glowing bright today. Perhaps with a little effort, he could build it into a fire. Alex looked up, deciding he would start simply. A walk. Maybe I should get a dog. A dog is a respectable gentleman's companion. A walk companion, even. A dog. Alex was interrupted by the doorman's sturdy utilitarian knock at his door. Ah, that will be Father. I know you think you can take all the time in the world now, but to me you're late, Alex said as he approached the opening door. Only, again, it was not his father. It was Julie in her gigantic coat, gently shedding a dusting of snow, and... Bastet! Alex exclaimed, rushing forward to pluck the mewing kitten from Julie's breast. Well, hello, and Merry Christmas to you too, Julie chuckled. Alex was briefly mortified, but relaxed when he saw the kindness in Julie's eyes. Oh dear, I forget myself, Alex said, mid-embrace with the kitten. Merry Christmas, Julie. He clasped her hand in a formal yet warm greeting and returned his attention to Bastet. To what do I owe the pleasure of this visit, he asked. Julie thought he looked strangely as if he were asking the cat. For the briefest moment, she thought the kitten might answer. She smiled involuntarily at their reunion, then remembered her mission. Well, I was hoping this would only qualify as a visit for me, Julie said sheepishly. For, Bastet? Is that what you called her? That's wonderful and very amusing. I'll have to tell you why. It's a very funny story. Oh, Alex, you will love this story. I'm rambling. Yes, Julie, Alex said calmly, grinning. His peaceful disposition eased Julie's nerves. I was hoping this would be a visit for me and a homecoming for Bastet. Can you keep her? Permanently? Julie watched Alex's face transform further. He smiled his big smile, his old smile, his Alex smile. Absolutely, Alex blurted. I do have one condition. For you, my dearest friend, anything, replied Julie. If the story involves you and Ramsay in your private liaisons, tell me the abridged version, Alex chuckled. I can fill in the missing pieces myself. He said this with such good humor, Julie was taken aback. And let me guess, he added, grinning, The thousands of years old immortal Egyptian king, who is accustomed to having every living creature do exactly as he wills, was not a huge fan of my good friend, the impish beauty, Bastet. Now it was Julie's turn to laugh. It felt like a salve to her heart to laugh with Alex after all this time. You are exactly right, said Julie with a smile in her voice. I'll let you fill in the details. Alex shook his head and joined her with a chuckle. He scratched Bastet's chin until she purred. She was putty in his hands, eventually offering up her belly for more petting. Julie knelt down and joined Alex in doting on Bastet. Julie described a few of Bastet's more notable hijinks for Alex, and a contented Alex smiled as Christmas surprise. Bastet. It felt right to hear the stories with Bastet as the hero, the brilliant goddess, warrior queen, adorable kitten, on an epic quest to annoy Ramses the Damned. Alex and Julie heard a commotion approaching footsteps, jubilant voices at Alex's door. It was Ramses and Elliot, in their winter overcoats, excitedly debating the potential value and future of motorcar technology. The one time the doorman doesn't knock, it is my father. Of course, thought Alex, amused. Merry Christmas, my boy, chimed Elliot. I hope you don't mind. I brought a guest to join us for our little Christmas charade. Not at all. Christmas is supposed to be a merry time with family and friends, and I can think of no better company, responded Alex. Alex and Julie bundled themselves in their winter coats. I thought we could start with a walk, said Alex, with an optimistic confidence. Julie beamed at him. Yes, this is good, said Ramses, putting his hand approvingly on Alex's shoulder. We should get our blood hot and pumping to celebrate this ridiculous cold day. Chuckling and laughing, the group began to depart. Alex turned to close the door, sneaking one more look at a happy little Bastet curled up on the carpet. Merry Christmas, little one, he said. Be good, he added, knowing she wouldn't be, and knowing that was exactly what he wanted.